We're so happy that you can join us today. Today we're here with Dr. Carrie Branch. She is a researcher and assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Branch is fascinated by the great diversity of signals that animals use to communicate. She studies how the environment shapes this variation and specifically looks at cognitive abilities and communication signals in birds. Dr. Branch teaches courses in animal behavior, animal communication, and animal cognition, where she aims to engage students in discussions on scientific research. When she isn't chasing little chickadees around the forest, she enjoys stand-up comedy and her hiking with her two adorable doggies. Welcome, Dr. Carrie Branch. We're so happy to have you today. So give us a little, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you study, and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for inviting me. This is a really fun opportunity. I love being given the chance to sort of share my research and what I do. It really energizes me, especially after an intense semester. So this is great timing. So as Tara mentioned, I'm interested in how small birds survive harsh winters and sort of what comes along with that. In terms of signaling and communication, as well as their cognitive abilities. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about today. But before I get into that, I wanted to share a little bit about my path to becoming a scientist. And so as you see here, I've always had a strong passion for animals. And this started, with domestic animals like dogs and cats, as you can see here, but very quickly included less common domesticated animals like my potbelly pig, Elvis there. I had a horse for some time and a chinchilla and birds and rabbits. We had all kinds of animals growing up. And this is still true today. And so here are some examples of some outreach opportunities that I've had in the past, as well as me with my two fluffy dogs. So I've always had this passion for animals. And so I thought, when I decided that I wanted to go to university, I was going to go to the University of Tennessee, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm from. And I thought originally that maybe I would want to be a veterinarian because I loved animals. And to me, that was, as far as I knew, that was really the only option to be able to work with animals. But after I was in high school, one of my high school biology teachers mentioned that it wasn't for them. And some of the reasons they explained resonated with me. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I don't want to be a veterinarian after all. And when I decided to choose a major at the University of Tennessee, I thought maybe I would go into psychology with counseling and becoming a therapist, because I really liked talking with people and hearing about what they were going through in their lives. And I was fortunate enough to be advised by an academic advisor, which is what happens for all students at universities. And he actually probed me a little on this. So I went into psychology for my undergrad degree. And he asked me, he's like, you're doing great in your classes. What else are you interested in? And I was like, well, I've always really loved animals, but I don't want to be a veterinarian. And, that's sort of obviously that's the only career option, right? And he was like, no, not at all. There's all these other things that you can do. You could do research with animals. And this just opened a whole new world for me. I had no idea that you could make a career in studying animals and that's what professors were doing. So they don't just teach, right? We teach our courses, but really what we're doing behind the scenes is lots of research. And so that started my journey. So here's just a little quick guide to my travels and where my academic career has taken me. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the different science I've done and how I've led to these different topics. If you'd asked me when I entered university if I would be studying communication and cognition in birds, I would have thought you were crazy because I didn't know anything about birds. I didn't really care about birds. I guess that's not fair. I liked birds because they were animals, but I didn't have a particular interest in birds per se. I always liked small mammals like squirrels and mice and hamsters and things like that. So I started studying birds at the University of Tennessee out in the field, and I just fell in love with it. After that, I went on to North Carolina, where I studied memory and animal cognition in lab rats. So a bit of a shift in that regard. That experience taught me a lot about what I didn't want to do for my PhD. So I knew I wanted to go into academia and become a professor, but I didn't want to work with lab animals per se. So then I went back into the field and started working with birds again out in the University of Nevada, Reno. And that's where I finished my PhD. Following that, I continued working in that same system, working with these mountain chickadees, which is what the research I'll talk about today is on. And I went to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to do my postdoctoral work for about 3.5 years. And then finally, I got my permanent position here at the University of Western Ontario, where I'm actually taking more of a comparative approach to look at how the environment shapes communication and signaling across chickadee species more broadly. So this started again at the University of Tennessee. So here's some photographic evidence of me in the wild studying birds some time ago now. And I had this really great mentor, Dr. Jessica Owens, who's there in that photo. And she taught me really a lot about graduate school and what it would be like if I were to go into academia. And as I mentioned before, I just really fell in love with this. And I loved being outside, studying animals in their natural habitat. When I decided to go on to do my master's degree, I shifted gears a bit. So this was primarily studying communication. So how birds talk to each other, how do they exchange information across different species. So those species listed at the bottom there. We've got a Carolina chickadee, a tufted titmouse in the middle, and then a white-breasted nuthatch on the right. And then I'm holding a little house sparrow in that other photo as well. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I would be interested in cognition. I was studying psychology, so I decided to go and get my master's degree at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, where, again, I shifted gears a bit. This was a different approach where we're in the lab. We're still using ecologically relevant stimuli, so we're using odors for rats because they have a great keen sense of smell. An excellent ability to remember these different smells. They can remember up to like 80 smells with high accuracy. It's pretty impressive. And so this is the rodent odor span task that's pictured here. So I worked in this system for 2 years and I liked it, but I learned that I wanted to get back into more ecologically relevant questions that I wanted to ask. And so this sent me out to the University of Nevada, Reno, where I was really able to combine these two interests. So I was able to combine the cognitive aspect, because in this lab, Dr. Pravasudov studies spatial cognition, but also with the previous work I had done in communication, I knew quite a bit about chickadees, and they have very complex communication systems. So I was like, okay, this could be the best of both worlds. I could do ask multiple types of questions here. And so that's what I did. And then again, I continued in this system until throughout my postdoctoral work, and I'm still working in this system now. So I'll go back this summer to collect data. And again, this is what I'll share with you today. Okay, so when we're thinking about how do animals survive winter, right? We often think about mammals that hibernate for long periods of time. So they store up a bunch of food, but then they reduce their energy needs by sleeping through the winter, essentially, right? But they actually reduce their body temperature quite a lot throughout this. And this is what we call hibernation, right? So we have our examples here of a black bear, a 13-lined ground squirrel. These are very common examples you think of. But in addition to mammals, there are also many amphibians and reptiles across all taxa, so all different types of animals that actually show this behavior. So they actually hibernate for months at a time, and then they'll emerge once the spring hits and it gets a bit warmer and the light tells them it's time to come out of the ground, right? So you could do that. You could hibernate. Alternatively, you could move to another location, right? So you could seasonally migrate, which means that typically speaking, we think of this as being, moving from one area in the wintertime to another to go breed, right? So you spend, a few months away from your winter home when you seasonally migrate, right? And we're often thinking of birds when we talk about this. So here's just an example of the different flyways that across the globe. So there are tons of species. Most species of birds do migrate, actually. And so these are just examples of the different flyways that they use, which means, from where they start all the way to where they end up and where they breed and back and forth, right? So they do that twice a year, moving from their breeding ground back to their wintering ground and vice versa, right? So you can move to a new location. You're following the resources, right? So maybe you create a situation where you don't need resources, right? Because you're snoozing and you've reduced your body temperature. You can leave, so follow the resources. And we see this, again, across a whole range of taxa. So this happens in many bird species, but we see it in butterflies, rattlesnakes, salmon. We have our pronghorn example here, and bats, right? So this occurs across taxa. We see all of these different strategies evolving, which is really interesting and exciting. And then finally, one other strategy would be to store food. So humans do that, right? We do that all the time. We store food in our refrigerator and in our pantry so that we can use it later, right? And animals do this as well. So they'll store food when it's abundant, so in the summer and the fall, and then they use that later when food is scarce. So throughout the winter time, for example, right? And so this ranges quite a bit. So you could be a scatter hoarding species where you take a bunch of food items and store them all throughout your territory, or you could take a bunch of food items and store them in one place, right? And this is what we would call larder hoarding. So scatter hoarding versus larder hoarding. It's a bit of a gradient. So scatter hoarding species are things like California scrub jays and gray squirrels. So they'll store food items all throughout their territories. Oftentimes they do this in the ground. So they actually end up propagating plants in a lot of instances. So they're not necessarily predators of the seeds in all situations. They can lead to dispersion of these seeds. In the middle there are things like Clark's nutcrackers and pinyon jays, which will store several items in one location, but still store them in multiple areas, right? So they'll have multiple locations where there's maybe a couple food items in one place, right? As opposed to a single food item in thousands of places, for example. And then finally, larder hoarding are things like this acorn woodpecker and a red squirrel. So the acorn woodpecker that's called a granary. So this is where they bring all of their acorns to the same place, and they'll defend that location for those resources. And the same is true for red squirrels. And so you can think about some of the trade-offs that might exist between storing a bunch of food items in all different places, right? Then you have to remember where all those things are. That can be pretty tricky and difficult. But alternatively, the likelihood that an individual finds all of your caches or your food stores is low, right? If they find one, all right, fair enough. But hopefully you can find them and get them out of your territory before they get too many of your food stores, right? But if you store everything in one place, you really don't have that opportunity. So if an individual comes and takes all of your food stores, you're kind of out of luck, right? But alternatively, you don't have to remember all those different places. You can just remember where all your food is hidden in this one location that you defend, right? So there's quite a gradient here in terms of how animals perform this task. And so here's an example of our mountain chickadee species, which I'll talk a little bit more about, which is a food caching bird. And you can see him here caching food. Chickadees are rather unique in the sense that they actually cache in the trees. So as you imagine, if it's snowing on the ground, or if there's a lot of snow on the ground, and you cache your food in the ground, you will not have access to that food once it's snowed 20 feet, right? So instead, they store their food all throughout the tree bark. So you can see the conifers create these really nice edges and things for them to be able to hide caches. And so that's what's happening here in this photo. And so when we think about caching food and remembering where all of these little items of food are, right, these birds will cache tens to hundreds of thousands of food items throughout the fall, right? And they remember those locations, which is pretty incredible. I can often not remember where I left my keys. So there's that, or where my phone is when it's in my pocket. But these birds are highly motivated and highly specialized to do this task, right? And so this is just an example of the songbird brain next to the human brain there. And you can see there are similar areas of the brain in both species, right? So they have some of the similar regions. You obviously notice that the songbird brain is much more smooth, which is true for most animals outside of humans, right? And they have these specialized brain regions, just like we do, for spatial cognitive tasks. So navigating your environment, figuring where you are in space, that actually differ from other associative learning tasks. So this is an area called the hippocampus. So here's an image in humans. So if you were to slice your brain in half and open up and look on the inside, that little yellow region there highlighted, that's the hippocampus. And it's called that because it looks like a seahorse. So hippocampus means seahorse, I believe in Greek or Latin. And so that's why it's called that. And this is this area that if you were to lesion it, individuals can no longer perform spatial tasks well, right? They can still make associations with colors or patterns or things like that, but their spatial navigation is totally thrown off. And we have a very similar region that we see in birds. It's actually on the top of their heads, which makes it really convenient to access for research. And a lot of folks have studied hippocampal morphology and their neuron size. So the brain cells that make up these regions, how big they are, their connections, and all of that type of thing, right? So this is sort of the cognitive function or basis for performing these tasks or performing this cognitive ability that they have, specifically related to space, right? So how do we test this in the lab? How do we know if animals are better or worse at performing these spatial cognitive tasks that are put on them? Well, I showed you an arena before. That was sort of what we used for my master's work when I was studying rats. And this is a very common apparatus that's used. So what we see here is an 8 radial arm maze up in the left, and then a circular platform down on the right. And the way this works is that each of the reward holes or reward targets are the same. There's nothing different about them other than where they are in space. So they're equidistant apart from one another. There's nothing specific to them. There's no color associated with it, anything like that. It's simply the spatial location that an animal is asked to memorize or remember, right? So that's generally how we study this in non-humans. And a lot of this work has been done in the lab across an array of different species. So we study spatial cognition specifically in mountain chickadees, right? So again, these are non-migratory birds, right? So they don't leave to go to warmer climates. They reside in the montane regions or the mountains of Western North America, highlighted here in this map. And so you can see the purple is sort of the abundance of the species throughout Western North America. They are food caching birds, as I've suggested, right? So they store all their food items when it's abundant, and then they use that later throughout the winter when food is scarce. And so we study them at Sage Hen Experimental Forest that's highlighted here in that star just right outside of Truckee, California. And so these birds, because they're food caching, they have this specialized spatial cognitive ability in order to retrieve those food caches. In addition to that, there's some interesting social dynamics that are involved with these birds that are kind of important to keep in mind as I'll talk about some of the research. So they live in what we call stable dominance hierarchies, right? Oh, let me go back, sorry. Stable dominance hierarchies, which means that males are always dominant to females, and older birds are always dominant to younger birds, right? And this is really important for their access to different resources. So these dominant individuals get better access to mates and territories and food. They're also what we call socially monogamous, which means that they pair in social pairs, but they will seek extra pair copulations, what we call it, outside of their social pair. And this is a really common strategy in most bird species. They actually will still participate, the male and female, in biparental care. So they'll help take care of the young because of them not having mammary glands like a lot of mammals, or like all mammals have, of course, right? Such that only the female can actually provide food to the young. This is not the case for birds, right? Males and females can both provide food, and they do. But they often seek these extra pair copulations to gain genetic benefits, whether it's an individual that's higher quality compared to their social mate, right? So this is the system that we study these questions in, and we study them along their montane gradient, right? So these birds persist across an elevation gradient, and what we're showing here is that the local environment can change quite a bit on a rather small spatial scale, right? And because of this, these elevation gradients really provide us with natural experiments where we can ask questions about how selection pressure, so selection pressure from the environment, is shaping behavior or shaping traits in animals, which is a really powerful design. And so this example here, these are our 2 field site locations right outside Truckee, as I mentioned. So we have our low elevation site, which is around 1,900 meters or 6,000 feet. And then our high elevation site, which is around 2,400 meters or closer to 8,000 feet. And so you can see this photo was taken on the same day, May 31st of 2017, which feels like eons ago now. But what you see is that our high elevation site is still covered in snow, while our low elevation site has no snow cover left, right? So probably don't have to tell you, but we know that the environment changes very predictably and rapidly along these elevation gradients, right? So this is only about 6 kilometers between these two, the end of one site and the beginning of another, right? And yet we see this drastic difference in their spring breeding environment, right? So these high elevation birds have all the snow cover left, which means that there isn't necessarily an abundance of food items, invertebrates that they like to use to feed their young, right? So as you can imagine, this creates really different selection pressures that have very different requirements for the birds living at one location versus another, right? So we were curious about whether or not their cognitive abilities reflect this. So is there elevation related differences in their abilities to, how much they cache food, the memory that they have, the abilities to find those caches, and their brain morphology associated with that? And indeed, what we find is that individuals at high elevations where their environment is harsher, they cache more food, they have better spatial memory abilities to recover that stored food, and they have larger hippocampus, so that area of the brain on top of their heads that underlies this ability, right? So these birds have a larger area with more neurons and more neurogenesis, so they produce more new neurons compared to their low elevation counterparts, right? In addition to that, as I mentioned, they live in these social structures in the fall, actually, is when this is happening. And so then they break up into breeding pairs in the spring. But what we saw when we brought birds into the lab is that in pairwise comparison, so when you take a high elevation bird and a low elevation bird and let them duke it out, what we see is that low elevation birds are actually dominant to our high elevation birds. So this creates this interesting dynamic where it seems like if you're a low elevation bird, you might think, oh, I'll just move up to high elevations, right? Where maybe I'll have better access to mates because I'm dominant, right? And I'll have access to these better resources potentially. But we think that's probably not likely because they don't have the superior spatial cognitive abilities to actually survive there, right? So they likely wouldn't survive the winter. And the flip side is true for high elevation birds, right? Well, it'd be easy enough if you're a high elevation bird to just move down to a warmer temperature, but they're socially subordinate, which means that if they are to move down to low elevation, they're going to suffer fitness consequences, right? So they won't get as good of access to mates or territories and things like that. So it seems like we have this situation where they're kind of being kept at their particular elevation sites, right? And that might lead to local adaptation over time, right? So they're locally adapted to their specific elevation, regardless of whether or not they're moving between those sites, because they can absolutely do that. And we do see some movement between these sites. But of course, that was all in the lab. And if we're interested in asking about survival benefits or what we call fitness consequences, right? So whether they have an increase in survival and reproduction, we actually need to look at this in the wild because chickadees will not breed in the lab. So we don't have that at our disposal. So this means we brought this whole idea and all of these questions into the wild, which is really exciting and very challenging. We've been doing this work since 2014. It'll actually be my 12th breeding season when I go out this year, which is really cool to be part of such a long-term system. It's very powerful. We can ask some really cool questions because of that. And so these long-term study systems are really important and critical, especially as the climate is continuing to change and escalate as we move into the future. So we collect data all year round. This involves starting in the fall. We start by trapping birds. We call it mist netting. So we put up these nets that are almost sheer, and the birds don't see them. They fly in to get access to food, and they get trapped in these nets. It doesn't hurt them. We extract them. They're perfectly fine. Chickadees are extra feisty and difficult to get out of the net. So if you can get a chickadee out of the net, you're set. You can get anything out. So you can see us there processing the birds at the table. So we'll equip them with bands so that we can uniquely identify them. We take a blood sample, just a small blood sample from them to do genomic analyses. We'll measure other things like how long their wing is and things like that to assess body condition as well. So then as the winter hits, this is when we start studying their cognitive abilities. So we test their spatial memory out in the field, which again is quite an undertaking. And I'll explain more about this task in just a moment. So we use this spatial array in order to ask the birds how good they are at remembering a location in space. And then as spring hits, we start monitoring their reproductive behavior. So we monitor boxes. So you can see there in that photo, we have a nest box. These are cavity nesting birds, secondary cavity nesting birds. So they readily nest in nest boxes, which is great for us. So we just check our 400 some boxes each year. We look for nesting material that shows the females started nesting there. And then we track those boxes throughout the entire breeding season. At the same time, I'm there collecting song from birds because I'm interested in whether or not things like secondary sexual traits, is what we call them, like song and plumage variation, actually reflect something about the spatial cognitive abilities of these birds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. And then, of course, as the summer progresses, we wait until about 16 days after the birds have hatched, the babies. So you can see them here, this little tiny guy with his little yellow mouth gape, which allows the parent birds to feed them more easily. And that goes away as they develop. But we band the nestlings as well, weigh them, and take a blood sample for paternity analysis. So that's sort of how we do this across the seasons. But more specifically, when we think about assessing spatial memory in the wild, we use sort of a similar task as what I showed you in the beginning, right, that we've used in lab spaces, but we've brought it out and made our lives much more difficult and more interesting. And so what you're seeing here, we use what's called passive integrative transponder tags on the bird. So that's that little purple tag there. That has an alphanumeric sequence unique to that bird. So every single bird has its own. And each of these feeders here that are hoisted up in the sky have radio frequency identification technology in them, which means that when a bird lands on a perch like this one here, if it is the correct perch for that or the correct feeder for that bird, and I'll talk a little bit about the methods in just a moment, it will open up and provide them access to a food reward. So the way that we get data from these is we pull them down from the trees, download the data, give it new batteries, and then hoist it back up into the sky. So here's sort of what this looks like. A bird comes in, lands on the perch. If it's the correct feeder for that bird, the door will open and give access to a sunflower seed reward, and then the bird flies off. So that's how we test their memory. You might be wondering, why are they hoisted up in the sky? This seems like extra work for nothing. Well, our bear friends that typically are hibernating, but not always, during the season, had other ideas when we thought we wanted to put them on the ground. They kept attacking them. That's an electric fence. This is a bed of nails that the babies are playing on. So we joked that we were studying bear cognition for some time. So that was quite frustrating. And then finally we were like, we got to put them up in the air. It seems to be the only solution. So alas, that's what we did. Okay, so what does this look like when a bird comes to the feeder, right? In a trial, a bird, at first, all of the doors are open and provide access to food. We'll assign a bird one particular feeder, and then they need to learn that that's the only feeder that will give them food. So we can look at, So we can look at how many errors a bird makes before going to the correct feeder. So this bird's made one error there, right? Because its correct feeder is the other one. That's another error. And then finally to the correct feeder, where it gets a food reward, right? So they have to sample across this spatial array to find their feeder. Then the next time, if they remember that location, they'll go directly to that feeder that gave them a reward. He sorted it out, right? So we can look at the number of errors they make on a trial, and we can average that across trials and see how their errors improve, right? So this guy, he crushed it. After the first 2 trials, he was like, I get it. This is the only one giving me food. So we can see sort of what we would call a learning curve there to see how quickly they learn that only one feeder will provide food for them. Okay. So one of the big questions we asked when we're thinking about selection and how the winter environment is affecting spatial cognition is whether or not birds that perform better on the task that I just showed, right? So perform fewer errors, are they more likely to survive the winter? Do we see them again the following season? And chickadees are great for this because they're non-migratory. They're very sedentary, which means they stay in the same location all year round. So when it comes to the next year and we haven't detected them either in the fall or in the spring or in the winter or in the spring, we can conclude that that bird didn't make it through to the next year. And we can use what we call age class comparisons in order to assess this. And so what we did is we compared first-year birds within a cohort, right, to see if individuals that survived performed better or worse. We also compared that to adult birds to see if adults on average are performing better. That's sort of a proxy for the idea that there's a age class association, but of course it could also be experience, right? So we also need to see if birds from year 1 to year 2 don't improve in their performance, right? So what I'm showing you here, and there'll be 2 figures like this. On the x-axis, we have the number of trials completed. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of location errors per trial, right? So that's the mean number they performed across 3, 5, 10, and 20 trials on our task. And just a reminder that fewer errors is better performance. So when we look at this figure here, we have individuals who died. So again, these are all first-year birds. So it's their first selection event in that winter. So individuals we didn't see again, so we are presumed to have died in blue, and those that survived in red. And what we see across all the trials is a significant difference between individuals that survived versus died. So those individuals that actually made it to the next season performed better on the task, so fewer errors across all trials compared to those that we didn't see again. And this carries on through when we look at adults versus juveniles, right? So juveniles being in that first year of their life. So same idea here, trials on the x-axis and performance on the y-axis. And again, adults in blue on average across all trials are performing better on the task compared to those juveniles, right? So juveniles are, because all of those individuals that won't make it, in that variation is included in this data set, right? What's interesting as well is that performance within an individual from year 1 to year 2 does not differ significantly. Within reason, there will be some change, but generally speaking, they don't get better with experience on the task. There seems to be some underlying genetic basis for their performance on this task, which is interesting, right? So this suggests, again, that individuals that perform better are more likely to survive from their first year through that winter season and into the breeding season. But of course, the other side of fitness, when we're talking about selection or natural selection acting on a trait, surviving is the first thing, right? You can't breed if you don't survive. But then, of course, the question is, do females care about this? Are females able to assess males that perform better? And if they do they increase their reproductive investment when they're mated to a male who performs better on the task, or a smarter male in this case? So we actually looked across these reproductive metrics. We looked at their first day that they lay an egg, which is typically individuals that lay earlier are of higher quality or dominant and more successful. We looked at their clutch size, so how many eggs they lay, their brood size, how many of those eggs actually hatched and came to fruition, as well as the mass of the nestling. So we looked at how much they weighed, because larger individuals are more likely to be recruited into the population and survive, right? So we looked at these different metrics based on the male's cognitive performance, right? So when we look at clutch size, so the number of eggs they lay, what we see is that when females are mated to a social male who performs better on our task, so makes fewer errors. So on the x-axis there, this is just the male's performance. So better being in green, and worse performance, or sorry, better towards the left and worse performance towards the right. And then the clutch size, so how many eggs they laid. And regardless of elevation, we see a significant relationship here where individuals that perform better on the task, females are laying larger clutches when they're mated to those males, which is really cool. And this translates into larger broods that they're fledging as well. So again, same sort of pattern here where the brood size that they actually fledge is higher when their social male shows better performance on our spatial memory task, which is really exciting for us because this suggests that females are somehow able to assess this trait in males and then make reproductive decisions based on that, which is really cool. Interestingly, we didn't see any relationship between male lay date or the nestling mass, which again suggests that it's not necessarily that these are better fathers. So if they were better fathers and better at provisioning young, you would expect the nestling mass to be associated with cognition. So smarter males would fledge larger offspring, but we didn't see that. So this suggests that females are gaining an indirect benefit or a genetic benefit by mating with these or having more offspring with their social males that are better on the task, right? But of course, we have to show that. And that's the next part that I wanted to share with you, which is really exciting. And so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but essentially what we did is you can take a behavioral trait in an organism, sample their genome, and look across that for a signal based on that particular trait. So we looked at birds across high and low elevations because we didn't want any extra confound of elevation, like how they're physiologically adapted to the location, right? We just wanted to be based on how they performed on the task. So we took individuals that performed really well on the task, both from high and low elevation, and individuals that performed fairly poorly on the task, so made more errors. We looked across their genomes and looked for a signal in what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, right? So these are single nucleotide changes in the genome. And what we see is that in instances where there are these divergent regions, they're associated with hippocampal growth and neuron development, right? This is really exciting because remember, that's the area of the brain associated with spatial cognitive abilities. So it's suggesting that there is indeed a genetic basis to this trait, which means it's heritable, can be passed on from generation to generation, and sort of fills the gap or closes the gap on showing that natural selection is acting on the spatial cognitive task or spatial cognitive ability in these birds, which is very exciting. So just to summarize, I've told you that mountain chickadees, or shown you that mountain chickadees exhibit cognitive adaptation on this really small spatial scale. So individuals at high elevations perform better than low elevation birds. I've shown you that females can discriminate among males with better and worse spatial cognitive abilities by increasing their reproductive investment based on the cognitive ability of their male to some degree. And finally, that there's a genetic basis to these spatial cognitive abilities such that they can actually pass this information on to their offspring and increase their likelihood of surviving. So if we're thinking about everything we need, all the boxes we need to tick in order for selection to be occurring, we have to have variation in the trait. The trait needs to be heritable, and it needs to confer a fitness advantage, right? And so that is critical in order for natural selection to lead to the evolution of different traits. Remembering, of course, that natural selection is just one mechanism of evolution and that there are several others as well. And we know that there's variation in the trait. This has been well documented throughout across taxa as well as within our system as well, right? So we see this variation in birds that perform better and worse on the task. We also showed that this is heritable. It has a genetic basis, right? And again, these two prongs of fitness, we see an increase in survival and an increase in reproductive output based on how they perform on this task. So indeed, there is a fitness advantage for birds with better cognitive ability. So we can take this all together and show that selection is indeed acting on spatial cognition in these birds, which is really exciting and cool. Because oftentimes we think of behavior as being very flexible and labile, that, selection's not acting on it. It's flexible within your lifetime. You can choose to do a behavior or not. It feels very volitional, right? Like you can choose to do it. But that's not necessarily the case. The environment absolutely shapes these behaviors in animals and in us as well. Okay, so just one final point to make, which is sort of trying to understand how females are assessing this variation, which is something that I'm really interested in. So in one instance, they may be directly observing birds in the fall. Again, these birds are in flocks, and within those flocks, they're paired up in these breeding pairs that will then separate out and breed in their breeding territories. So maybe because she spent all winter with these other males and with her male, she's seen how good he is at recovering food stores and how good his memory is. She's just directly observed that. What's more likely is that there's a secondary sexual trait. So the primary trait here would be the spatial cognitive ability that the female cares about potentially and wants her offspring to have. And I say cares about and wants as if it's a conscious thing. It's not. The environment's all shaping this, right? If that's associated with a secondary sexual trait, like variation in birdsong, which we know is a learned trait, or variation in their plumage. So these are overt characteristics that a female could assess that may just happen to be associated with their cognitive performance because they're generally higher quality individuals. So that's what we're looking into now. We're looking at song. So here's a little snippet. It's the illustrious song of the mountain chickadee. It's quite simple, but we can gain a lot of information from it. As you can see here, we measure their songs in a software called Raven Pro. We're also measuring differences in plumage patches as well as reflectance that differs in their plumage patches. We can measure this using something called a spectrometer because, believe it or not, birds can see in the UV, while humans can't. We have three cones. Birds have 4 cones. They're tetrachromates, and they can actually see UV light. So we use a special machine called a spectrometer to assess that and to quantify this variation. Okay, so with that, I always like to say that science is a team sport. None of this could be done without all of these collaborators that are listed on the screen here, which is quite a few, as well as funding sources. So just a reminder that, none of this stuff is done in a vacuum. People are constantly working together. This genomic work would not have been possible without our collaborators at Colorado Boulder, who did the heavy lifting in the genomic area. And then just a little last slide of me enjoying the outdoors, because while graduate school is a lot of work and it's very difficult, we have the privilege of living in some beautiful areas and being able to travel to cool places to do some of this work. So thanks so much. I'd love to answer any questions.
Is muted. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Branch. That was amazing. Your work is really fascinating and exciting, and it looks so fun to go out to the sites that you get to visit. Speaking of like the sites that you're out at, what is, another challenging aspect about collecting your data? You talked about trying to fight off little bears, from eating sunflower seeds and stuff like that. But what else is like really challenging about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's, field work, you have to be persistent, oftentimes you have a plan and best laid plans go completely awry because what you think is going to happen in the field is not actually the reality. And so you're always having to troubleshoot or kind of shift gears. So just being persistent and going again and again. These are wild animals you're working with, right? So they're not always going to do what you want them to do. You're kind of at their mercy. And so we use little tricks here and there, relying on this spatial or them accessing our feeder, which they're very motivated to do because they're food caching birds, and they will cache and cache and cache until their little heart can't take it anymore. But yeah, absolutely. So we have to, be clever in terms of how we ask questions and collect data just based on the life history and ecology of the species we're interested in. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Another question from the crowd. Which bird has the highest IQ?
Oh, man. So that's an interesting question. We often get questions about sort of intelligence in animals and how smart they are. I think, I don't know specifically in terms of the highest IQ, but I will say crows and ravens are very, very clever birds. They can do some outstanding things, and they have this ability to sort of recognize what other individuals are doing in their environment and respond to that, which is a really complex cognitive ability. So I would say crows and ravens are probably pretty high up there, things like that. And even other corvids. So jays and things like that are, they're almost too clever to keep in captivity because it's they can't handle it. I feel like chickadees are just clever enough where they'll do really cool, complex cognitive tasks, but they can deal with being in captivity. Whereas jays are nope. This is not enriched. There's not enough enrichment here. So you have to have really large outdoor aviaries and things like that or hand rear them if you're going to study things like corvids and jays there.
Awesome. And I guess a good follow-up to that is, so why do birds exist with poor memory? Why hasn't nature selected them out?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's one that we get quite often, right? So I think one thing is, when we're thinking about our chickadees, none of them are dumb. None of them are terrible. Some of them are, and then they don't make it into the next season. But the key there is that this is a really what we call highly polygenic trait, which means there's a lot of genes associated with performance on this task. In addition to that, the environment is changing all the time. So there's annual variation that can allow perhaps an individual that doesn't perform particularly well to survive one year when it's a harsher winter. We don't see them survive, for example, if it's milder. But really, this polygenic landscape of the genetic architecture, we think is what contributes to this, right? So it's not just one gene that's determining performance or underlying their ability. So because of that, this allows quite a bit of variation to persist in the task or in their abilities. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And last question. How can our listeners at home engage in citizen science and help record bird observations in their own backyards?
Oh man, there's so many resources for you. So I mentioned before that I did my postdoctoral work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I'm so proud to have been at that organization for any amount of time. It's really incredible, the work that they're doing. They create all kinds of resources for folks to contribute for free, right? So you can do things like download the Merlin Bird app, which will help you identify birds in your area based on, what they look like. You don't have to know anything about birds. It will be like, okay, where are you? What time is it? What's the bird doing? What colors is it? And then it will give you a list and you'll be like, oh, that looks like the bird. And then you send that back to them and they'll be like, yep, that bird is there. For more advanced birders, as we call them, folks who are enthusiastic about birds, you can use things like eBird, which is actually, going on a walk, a nature walk, for example, and noting all the different bird species that you see. And now that data gets combined and they're actually doing really cool science using that data. So you become a citizen scientist in that way. One final one that I want to kind of mention, because it's one that I use fairly often for my actual research, as I talked about the mountain chickadee research, but I have some new directions that I'm going into as well, which is, again, trying to understand how the environment shapes vocal variation or communication. And so there's something called BirdNet, which is another app where you can, it's sort of like Shazam for birds, which Merlin does this too. So you can figure out what bird is singing in your backyard, which is really cool, especially this time of year. It's the perfect time to get that started. But in addition to that, BirdNet will actually tell you who the bird is, but also upload that to the cloud so that scientists can use that information. So I can get, information about vocal behavior across the whole range of different species, which is really cool. There's also things like Project Feeder Watch and Project Nest Watch that the Lab of Ornithology does as well. So if you go to their website, like allaboutbirds.org, this is not a paid advertisement for Cornell. But all of this stuff is free for you to access. They have an incredible amount of resources. So I highly suggest folks check it out.
That is so awesome. Thank you so much. It was fascinating hearing about the work that you do. And I personally can't wait to get out there and go and, check out the birds in my backyard and hopefully contribute to some citizen science. But thank you so much, Dr. Branch. Have a great day.
Take care.